Snow fell over the valley like slow forgiveness. Each flake drifted through the pale morning air, whispering against fences and chimney smoke, softening the hard outlines of a land that had known too much silence. The river below Cochise Greyhawk's cabin lay sealed under ice, a still mirror reflecting the sky's long sorrow. He stood outside, coat unbuttoned, breath fogging in the cold. At 60, his frame still carried the strength of the warrior he once was, broad shoulders beneath white hair bound at the nape by a strip of rawhide. The years had carved lines deep into his face, but his eyes, the color of burned cedar, held a patient calm, like a man who'd been waiting for nothing for far too long. He was mending a saddle strap, fingers moving slow but sure. His horse, a gray mare with a scar over her flank, shifted restlessly beside him. "Easy, Dawn," he murmured, voice low as distant thunder. The mare lowered her head. He smiled faintly. In a world that spoke too much, animals never lied. He liked that about them. From the hills came the faint jingle of a sleigh bell. Cochise paused, head lifting. No one visited this far out, not in weather like this. The sound drew nearer, muffled by snow, until a lone figure emerged between the cottonwoods. A woman wrapped in a faded green shawl, her boots sinking deep with every step. Her hair was white, though she could not have been much younger than he. She moved carefully, one gloved hand clutching a basket. Eleanor Whitmore. The widow from the edge of town. He had seen her once in summer, teaching the children letters beneath the church porch. That day her laugh had sounded like water, soft but stubbornly alive. Now in winter, that laugh had vanished. She stopped a few yards from him, cheeks flushed, snow clinging to her lashes. "Your mare's hurt," she said gently. "Sheriff Grady mentioned it when he brought supplies through town." Cochise straightened, nodding once. "A small cut from the wire fence. I can tend it." "I brought salve," she replied, lifting the basket slightly. "It keeps infection away. Better than whiskey." He hesitated, the polite refusal already forming on his tongue, but something in her eyes stopped him. They were not pleading, not proud either, just kind. The sort of kindness that embarrassed men who'd forgotten how to accept it. He stepped aside and gestured toward the stable. "Come in. Wind's colder than it looks." Inside, the air smelled of pine resin and straw. She set her basket on a beam and knelt by the mare's leg, her touch gentle but firm. Cochise watched her work, unsure why the simple act unsettled him. Her movements carried the grace of someone who had lived a life of service, efficient, quiet, unthanked. "Doesn't seem deep," she murmured, cleaning the wound. "But she's old. Scars open easy when they heal over too soon." He didn't answer, but something in her words struck deeper than she meant. When she looked up, she found him studying her face, and for a heartbeat neither spoke. Snowflakes caught in her hair glimmered like starlight, melting into strands of silver. "How far did you walk?" he asked finally. "From the schoolhouse," she said. "The sleigh stopped 2 miles out, path was blocked by drifts." "That's too far alone." Her smile was thin but warm. "Everything's too far alone." He looked away first, clearing his throat. "You should take tea before heading back." "I can't stay long." "You shouldn't go soon either." Their words lingered between them like smoke, unsure if they meant safety or longing. She rose, brushing snow from her shawl, and for a moment her hand brushed his arm. The contact startled him. It had been years since another human had touched him without reason. "You're colder than the walls," she said softly. "Do you ever light a fire for yourself, or only for the beasts?" He gave a dry chuckle. "Beasts are easier company. They don't ask questions." "Then maybe they're missing your answers." He said nothing. She tied the bandage around the mare's leg, her fingers trembling slightly with the chill. When she stood, he noticed a faint bruise along her wrist. "Someone hurt you?" he asked quietly. "No," she said quickly, then sighed. "Just fell on the ice." He didn't believe her, but he let the lie rest between them, understanding that sometimes dignity wears the mask of denial. Outside, wind rattled the boards. She pulled her shawl tighter. "You live out here without anyone checking on you?" "I've had enough company to last a lifetime," he replied. And not all of it left me standing. She met his gaze with that same unflinching gentleness. We all bury something in the snow. Cochise swallowed. He wanted to tell her about the grave on the hill, the one marked only by river stones, the place where he spoke to the wind when the world grew too loud. But his tongue refused. Words, once broken, were hard to mend. She turned toward the door. If you need more salve, I'll bring it next week. I won't, he said too quickly. She paused. Then I'll bring it anyway. He almost smiled. Almost. When she stepped outside, snow was falling thicker. She lifted her skirt slightly to walk, boots crunching softly. He followed to the doorway, arms crossed, watching her small figure fade through the white drift. The shawl fluttered behind her like a leaf trying to find a home. Halfway down the hill, she stopped and looked back. Their eyes met across the storm. For a moment, it was as if all the unspoken winters of their lives stood still. Then she nodded once, a gesture neither farewell nor promise, and continued walking. Cochise stayed there long after she vanished. Around him, the wind sighed against the cabin walls, carrying the faint scent of the salve she'd left behind, lavender and smoke. It lingered longer than he expected. By dusk, the valley grew blue with shadow. He lit the hearth, though he rarely did. The flames licked high, filling the cabin with uneven light. On the table lay the small jar she had forgotten. He turned it in his hands, noticing her initials carved faintly on the lid. E.W. He thought of her words. Everything's too far alone. The truth of it burned more than the fire. Later, when he stepped outside to fetch water, he saw something glinting beneath the pine near the fence. A broken brooch, half buried in snow. He picked it up. It was hers. He remembered the silver curve at her collar. He brushed it clean, tracing the small engraving of two birds facing each other. He could return it tomorrow. Or the next day. Or never. But as he looked toward the distant glow of the town beyond the frozen fields, he felt a tug he hadn't known since youth. Not desire exactly, but a pull toward something that still believed in second chances. The wind rose, swirling snow into ghostly shapes. He could almost hear laughter, hers, blending with the storm. He clenched the brooch in his fist, eyes narrowing against the cold. Everything's too far alone, he whispered to himself. Maybe that's the sin we all pay for. Inside, the fire cracked, echoing her earlier question. Do you ever light a fire for yourself? And for the first time in years, he didn't answer the silence with silence. He took the jar of salve, placed it near the window, and left the lamp burning through the night. Outside, snow kept falling, erasing tracks, covering graves, softening fences. Yet beneath that endless white, something small but alive had started to stir. Something he didn't have a name for yet. And far down the valley, where the road bent toward town, Eleanor Whitmore stopped under the lantern glow of the bridge, pressing a hand to her chest. She realized her brooch was missing. But instead of turning back, she smiled faintly, as if knowing exactly where it had gone. The storm swallowed her silhouette, but Cochise's lamp glowed all through the dark, a single point of light in the wide, unending snow. And for the first time in decades, the wind around his home didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like breath returning to a long silent heart. The thaw came slow that winter, and with it came whispers. In the town of Whitestone, gossip traveled faster than the river's melt, curling through saloon doors and church pews alike. It was the kind of talk that didn't shout. It lingered, half-smiled, half-poisoned. They said the widow Whitmore had been seen walking toward the old Apache's ranch again, and in a place that measured a woman's worth by how little she was seen, that was enough to turn warmth into distance. Eleanor noticed it first in the post office. Mrs. Carter, who once shared recipes and laughter, turned her back sharply at the counter. The clerk handed over her letters with a politeness too rehearsed. Outside, two ranchers' wives huddled beneath the awning, their whispers slicing through the falling snow like dry branches breaking under weight. A woman her age ought to know shame, one said, not softly enough. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her basket. She wanted to tell them that shame was a luxury of the young, that after burying husbands, dreams, and children unborn, dignity was all that remained. But she said nothing. Pride was the only defense quiet souls had left. She walked on, each step pressing her name deeper into the frost. Cochise heard the same whispers in another form. At the saloon, where men gathered to trade dust and stories, someone mentioned the widow's visits with a grin that carried no kindness. The ghost horse found himself a winter companion, a voice sneered. Laughter followed, brittle as glass. Cochise looked up from his drink, eyes steady, unreadable. "Speak careful," he said. The room went still. The man raised his hands, smirking. "Just talk, Greyhawk. Don't get sore." Cochise stood, calm as a storm before the break. "Then talk where I can't hear it." He left without finishing his whiskey. Outside, the air cut sharp, but it wasn't the cold that bit, it was memory. He'd been called worse in his life: savage, outcast, widower, ghost. But this new word, whispered behind her name, hurt different. It wasn't for him, it was for her. 2 days later, Eleanor came to his ranch again. She brought bread wrapped in cloth, though neither of them mentioned it. He met her outside the stable, his face a mix of gratitude and guardedness. "You shouldn't have come," he said. "I've heard that before," she replied lightly, though her eyes betrayed fatigue. "The town's cruel when it's bored. Then let it starve." Her defiance stirred something deep in him, something that remembered battlefields, and the women who waited for men who never returned. She brushed past him to check the mare's bandage. "You changed it," she noted. "You taught me how. That's what teachers do, make themselves unnecessary." He watched her fingers, deft and trembling, moving as if each small act might keep the world from unraveling. He wanted to tell her she wasn't unnecessary, that her presence had broken the silence in his house like dawn breaks the dark. But his tongue stayed still. When she finished, she turned toward him with that gentle, weary smile. "They're saying I shouldn't come here," she said softly. "I know. What do you think?" He met her gaze, the question burning between them like unlit fire. "I think they've forgotten what forgiveness looks like," he said finally. "And when people forget that, they start mistaking kindness for sin." Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, but she only nodded. For a moment, neither moved. Snow drifted through the open stable door, settling on her shawl like feathers. Later that week, she passed the churchyard and found her own name etched faintly on the gossip board behind the well, a crude drawing beside it. She stood there for a long time, reading the malice dressed up as humor, until Sheriff Grady appeared beside her. "Eleanor," he said gently, "you know how folks get. They get small," she answered, voice steady. "Cold makes them cruel." He sighed, hat in hand. People remember Cochise from the raids long ago. Some can't see past what he was. Then they never saw what he became. The sheriff looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're braver than they deserve." That night, the snow returned heavier. She walked home beneath its hush, her boots leaving shallow prints that filled almost as soon as they were made. At her porch she saw something waiting. A small wooden carving, smoothed by hand, shaped like 2 doves in flight. No note, no ribbon. Just the carving, and a single feather tucked beneath it. She smiled despite herself. The next morning, she went to thank him. The air was thick with frost, sun caught in ice crystals that shimmered like stars fallen to earth. When she reached his cabin, he was splitting wood, each strike echoing across the frozen field. She held up the carving. "You made this," she said. He shrugged. "Hands remember things when words forget." "I'd forgotten how to smile," she said quietly. He looked up, eyes meeting hers with the faintest flicker of something unguarded. "Then keep it," he said. "Maybe it'll remind you." They stood close enough for breath to mingle in the cold. She wanted to thank him properly, to tell him what it meant to be seen without pity. But before she could, distant hoofbeats sounded down the trail. She turned to see 2 townsmen on horseback, slowing as they neared. Their faces were wary, lips tight. "Cochise," one called. "Town meeting tonight. Sheriff says there's talk about your land. Some folks think you shouldn't be living this close to the white settlement." Eleanor stiffened. "That's nonsense." The rider shrugged. "Maybe. But they're saying it loud." Cochise's jaw tightened. I've been here longer than most of them. Doesn't matter, the man replied, spitting into the snow. Some wounds don't heal, they just freeze over. When the men rode off, the silence left behind was heavy as snowfall. Eleanor turned to him, heart aching at the stillness in his face. Will you go? She asked. No, he said simply. If I leave every time they hate me, I'll never stand anywhere. She stepped closer. Then I'll stand here with you. He shook his head. You'll lose more than you gain. I've already lost enough to know what's worth keeping. Her voice trembled, not with fear but conviction. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached into his coat and drew out the silver brooch she had lost. He held it in his palm, the two engraved birds glinting softly. It belongs to you, he said. She looked at the piece, then at him. Maybe it never did. Their eyes held, a quiet defiance shared between two souls long punished for surviving. The snow thickened around them, muting the world, wrapping the cabin in ghostly white. She reached out, touching his wrist lightly, and for a fleeting instant the gesture seemed to warm the air itself. Then she stepped back, shawl drawn close. They'll talk, she whispered. Let them, he answered. Winter's long. Their tongues will tire before the thaw. She laughed softly, a sound like the first crack of ice in spring. As she walked away, he watched her figure vanish into the white, the brooch still gleaming faintly in her hand. Behind him, the fire in his hearth flared higher, though he hadn't fed it. And somewhere beyond the ridge, a church bell tolled, a hollow sound that seemed to mourn the town more than it warned it. For the first time, he wondered if forgiveness was not something the town had lost, but something waiting to be taught again. Perhaps by two old souls brave enough to keep walking through snow toward each other. The storm came without warning, crawling down from the northern ridge like a living thing. By dusk, the wind howled through the valley, carrying with it a cold that gnawed straight to the bone. Trees bent under the weight of the snow, fences vanished into drifts, and the narrow trail from town was swallowed whole. Inside his cabin, Cochise Greyhawk fastened the shutters against the gale, and listened to the blizzard roar like some ancient ghost trying to speak through centuries of silence. He fed the fire another log and sat near it, the orange light painting his scarred hands in restless shadows. The room was warm, but something in him felt hollow, echoing. He had spent decades learning to live with solitude, until now it no longer fit him. The quiet pressed too close. He stared at the brooch on the table, its silver wings glinting softly. It had become a question he could not answer. Why he kept it, why her face would not leave his mind, why the memory of her voice, low, steady, kind, seemed to thaw something inside he thought long frozen. A sudden thud at the door broke his thoughts. Another followed, faint, desperate. Cochise rose swiftly, pulling the latch. The wind burst in, scattering snow across the floor. And there, half collapsed against the threshold, was Eleanor Whitmore, her shawl stiff with frost, lips pale as the sky. Eleanor, he breathed, catching her before she fell. Her body was cold, too light. He carried her inside, closing the door against the storm, then knelt by the fire, pulling blankets around her trembling frame. I couldn't see the road, she whispered, breath-catching. The sleigh overturned near the river. I walked, tried to find the lights. He pressed a hand to her forehead. Hush. You're safe now. She tried to sit, but the effort stole her strength. You shouldn't have let me come, she murmured. He gave a short, helpless laugh. And yet you did. Her lashes fluttered, then closed. He rubbed her hands between his palms, feeling how fragile she had become in the cold. Each moment, her breathing steadied. When her eyes opened again, the firelight found them, soft brown turning gold, like sap warmed by sun. I thought of you, she whispered. When the wind started. I thought, if this is how I end, at least it's near something kind. His throat tightened. He didn't answer. He only lifted another blanket, tucking it around her shoulders, his fingers brushing the loose strands of her hair. They gleamed like moonlit silver. Outside, the storm raged harder, battering the roof. The cabin creaked like an old ship. Inside, the only sound was the fire's slow, even breathing. Hours passed that way. He kept the flames alive and listened to her sleep. Small, steady sounds that reminded him he wasn't alone anymore. When she stirred, he poured broth into a tin cup and lifted it to her lips. "You take care of people like it's a duty," she said quietly. "It's habit," he replied. "No," she corrected gently. "It's love." The word struck him like a bell, sharp and deep. He turned away, staring at the flames. "Love cost me too much. I stopped paying long ago." She reached out, fingers trembling, and touched his wrist. "Peace costs more." He looked at her then, really looked. The wrinkles around her mouth, the faint bruising of time under her eyes, the curve of her hands weathered by years of labor. And yet, she was beautiful. Not the kind that blinds, but the kind that stays, the beauty of endurance, of someone who has walked through storms and still found grace in her step. "Why do you come here?" he asked softly. "Because you make the world quiet," she said. "And in that quiet, I can hear what my heart's been trying to say." "What does it say?" She smiled faintly. "That it's tired of being alone." The fire cracked, sending sparks into the air. He wanted to reach for her then, but fear kept his hands still. Fear of being seen, of being known. For men like him, love wasn't a gift, it was a reckoning. "You shouldn't say such things," he murmured. "The town will think worse." "Let them," she said. "They've forgotten that the heart has no age." He laughed quietly, a sound like broken stones smoothing under water. "You talk like the old stories my mother told. Maybe I've lived long enough to believe them again." Outside, the wind howled and then began to fade. The storm, like anger, was running out of breath. Inside, the cabin glowed warmer, a small world cut off from judgment and time. She leaned closer to the fire, hands extended toward its warmth. "It's strange," she said. "All my life I thought love would be a thunderbolt. But it feels more like this, quiet, slow, dangerous only if you're foolish enough to look away." He stared at her profile, the way the light shaped her face. "You think I'm foolish?" "I think you're afraid," she said softly. "And afraid men are the loneliest of all." Something in him broke, not loudly but cleanly. He moved closer, sitting beside her. The air between them changed, charged but still, like the hush before sunrise. She turned her head toward him. "You can rest, you know. The war's over." His voice was barely a whisper. "Which one?" "The one inside you." He wanted to tell her that war never ends for men who once carried death in their hands. That even peace feels like betrayal when you've survived what others didn't. But instead, he said nothing. She didn't need his ghosts. She only needed him to stop fighting them. She reached up, brushing a strand of hair from his brow. The touch was light, reverent. His eyes closed as if it were prayer. When he opened them, she was still watching him, her face calm but unreadable. The firelight made her seem half made of gold, half of memory. "You'll catch my fever," she whispered, half smiling. "Maybe I've had it longer than you," he said. They both laughed then, quietly, the sound fragile but alive. The storm had stilled outside. The world had narrowed to this: a fire, two old souls, and the knowledge that something unnamed had begun to grow in the cracks of their silence. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He froze, not from discomfort but disbelief. The weight of her felt like truth. For the first time in years, his breath fell into rhythm with someone else's. Time passed like slow honey. The fire dimmed, then brightened again as he added more wood. He listened to her breathing, the faint sigh when she drifted between waking and rest. He thought of the town, of its frozen hearts, of the way people punished tenderness because they no longer remembered how to bear it. And he realized he didn't care. "Eleanor," he said quietly. She stirred. "Yes." "Why me?" "Because," she said after a moment, "you've forgotten how to ask to be loved, and I've spent my whole life waiting to remind someone." The simplicity of it undid him. He felt his throat close, but no tears came, just warmth, strange and full, spreading through the cracks inside his chest. Outside, the storm finally broke apart. The wind died into soft snow, and the valley exhaled. Cochise reached for her hand. Their fingers met halfway, hesitant, trembling, then stayed. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was whole. The fire burned lower, but neither of them moved. Beyond the window, dawn bled slowly into the world, faint streaks of rose and gray above the mountains. She whispered, "You'll light another fire when I'm gone?" He smiled faintly. "Only if the snow keeps falling. And if it stops? Then I'll wait." Her eyes closed, her head still resting against his shoulder. He thought she'd fallen asleep, but after a long pause, she whispered one last time, so softly he almost didn't hear. "Maybe you've waited long enough." He looked down at her, the faintest smile curving his mouth, though his eyes shimmered in the firelight. Outside, the snow began again, slow and quiet, as if to answer her. And in that hush, Cochise felt something shift deep within him, the first crack of thaw beneath years of winter. The kind of warmth that could burn even through snow. When morning came, the storm had vanished as suddenly as it had begun. The world outside lay silent, covered in a pale, endless stillness. The snow glittered like ground glass beneath the first light, untouched but for the faint trail of deer crossing the far ridge. Inside, the fire had burned to embers. Cochise stirred awake in his chair, stiff from the long night. Eleanor still leaned against him, her breath soft and even. For a moment, he simply watched her sleep, unwilling to move, unwilling to let the fragile peace dissolve. Her hair spilled across his arm like silver threads. Each rise and fall of her chest reminded him that life, quiet and unassuming, still pulsed in this frozen land. He thought of all the winters before, each one spent trying not to feel, not to remember. Yet here she was, soft warmth against his side, undoing every defense with the simplicity of trust. He rose carefully, draping another blanket around her shoulders before stepping to the window. The air beyond was clear, blue, infinite. The snow had stopped, but its silence lingered, a silence that did not accuse but invited. For the first time in years, he did not dread the light. He stood there a long while, then turned back to her. When Eleanor woke, her voice was little more than a whisper. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I did," he replied. "Just not enough to dream." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what we've been doing all our lives. Dreaming through the wrong winters." He knelt beside her. "You're safe now. You should rest another day." But she shook her head. "I need to go into town. They'll think I've disappeared. They'll think what they always do." Her eyes softened. "Then let them see me alive. That's punishment enough." He wanted to stop her, to keep her in this cabin where judgment could not reach, but he saw the resolve in her expression, dignity wrapped in gentleness. So instead he saddled the mare and walked her to the door. The air outside bit cold, but sunlight spilled across the snow like promise. Eleanor paused on the threshold, turning toward him. "Thank you," she said, "for not letting me fade." He wanted to tell her that she'd done the same for him, that her presence had melted a frost no fire ever could. But the words refused to form. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pressed the silver brooch into her palm. "You should wear it again," he murmured. "The world should remember what beauty looks like." Her eyes glistened. "And what about you, Cochise Greyhawk? What should the world remember of you?" "That I lived long enough to stop running," he said simply. She smiled and turned away, leading the mare down the path. Her figure grew smaller against the white horizon, until she vanished into the brightness. For a long time he stood there, the cold wind threading through his hair, the quiet wrapping him like a prayer unfinished. By noon, the town's bell began to toll. He heard it faintly from the valley, 3 slow rings, the signal for a gathering. He knew its meaning before the echo faded. Something inside him tightened. When Eleanor arrived in town, she found the people gathered outside the church, faces stern, voices low. Sheriff Grady stepped forward, worry etched into the lines around his eyes. "Eleanor," he said, "they're talking nonsense. Some want to drive Cochise off his land. Claim it isn't right for him to live near the settlement. I've been trying to calm them, but they won't listen." She met the crowd's gaze, her posture unshaken. "You're talking about a man who's harmed no one. A man who saved my life last night." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "He's an Apache. They don't change." Eleanor's voice cut through the air like a bell. "And what are you then, if you can't forgive?" No one answered. She stepped forward, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "You call yourselves Christians, but your hearts are frozen as the fields. You speak of sin while condemning kindness. I won't stand for it." Grady touched her arm gently. "Eleanor." "No, Sheriff," she said. "Let them hear the truth." She turned to the crowd again. "You've spent your lives fearing ghosts. But the only ghosts left are the ones you make with your hatred." The square fell silent. Snow drifted from the rooftops, slow and soundless, like the world holding its breath. And then, a new sound, hoofbeats. Heavy, steady. Cochise appeared at the edge of town, his white hair gleaming against the sunlight, his horse moving with deliberate calm. He dismounted without a word. Every eye followed him as he walked toward them, boots crunching softly in the snow. He stopped beside Eleanor, his expression unreadable. "I heard the bell," he said. The man who had spoken earlier sneered. "You should have stayed on your land, Greyhawk." Cochise's gaze was steady, unflinching. "My land ends where fear does. You decide how far that is." No one spoke. The wind whispered through the pines. Eleanor stepped closer to him, her hand brushing his sleeve in quiet defiance. The gesture said what words could not. "I stand with you." And somehow, that single act broke the tension. A few turned away. The sheriff cleared his throat. "There's no law against kindness," he said finally. "Meeting's over." One by one, the townsfolk dispersed, their faces unreadable. Some looked ashamed. Others simply confused. When the last of them had gone, Cochise turned to Eleanor. "You shouldn't have stood up for me," he said softly. "They'll make you pay for it." She looked up at him, eyes fierce and tender all at once. "Then let them. I've paid for silence long enough." He exhaled slowly, a cloud of steam rising between them. "You'll never have peace here." "Then I'll have it there," she said, nodding toward the valley. "With you." He froze, the meaning settling like dawn breaking over mountains. "Eleanor." "Don't tell me no again," she whispered. "I've waited my whole life for you to stop hiding." For a moment, the world stilled. The air, the snow, even the birds. And then, something inside him gave way. He reached for her hand, his rough fingers trembling. When he spoke, his voice was raw. "I said I can't be a husband." She smiled, tears bright in her lashes. "Then be my home instead." He closed his eyes. The weight of years of grief and exile lifted like smoke. When he opened them again, her face was all he saw, steady, luminous, real. He pulled her into his arms, and the world seemed to exhale. The snow on the roof slid loose, tumbling in soft waves. A single bell chimed in the distance, its tone gentle now, almost forgiving. Later, as they rode back through the valley, the sun began to set. The snow caught the light, turning gold and rose. Behind them, Whitestone shimmered faintly, its harsh edges softened by distance. At the ridge, Eleanor looked back once, then leaned into him. "It's beautiful when the snow stops," she said. Cochise nodded. "That's when you see what survived beneath it." She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as they descended into the quiet. The trail wound toward the cabin, where smoke already curled from the chimney, a promise of warmth waiting. The narrator's voice lingered like breath in cold air. Some hearts freeze to protect themselves. Some wait beneath the ice, patient as the earth, until a kind hand teaches them to thaw. If you've been waiting, don't be ashamed. The snow always stops, eventually, and when it does, the fire you thought had died will find you again. And in the valley below, two figures rode through the fading light, silver-haired, slow and steadfast, proof that even the oldest winters can end in spring.